In the heart of the Reformation, Martin Luther, a name that echoes through the annals of Christian history, stands as a towering figure of revolution and controversy. His bold challenge to the authority of the Church and his radical reinterpretation of Scripture have left an indelible mark on the world. Yet, beneath the surface of his fiery rhetoric and unwavering faith lies a complex and often contradictory legacy. This video delves into Luther's approach to biblical interpretation, the ways in which his methods and beliefs shaped the Reformation, and the lasting impact of his ideas on Christian theology and practice. Luther's critique of ecclesiastical authority was nothing short of a seismic shift in the religious landscape of the 16th century. He argued that the Bible, not the Church, should be the ultimate authority in matters of faith. This was a radical departure from the prevailing medieval view, which regarded the Church as the custodian of divine truth. Luther's conviction that the Bible was self-interpreting and clear in its meaning, sola scriptura, was a cornerstone of his reformist agenda. However, this conviction also led to some of the most contentious and paradoxical aspects of his theology. One of the most striking aspects of Luther's approach to the Bible is his rejection of allegorical interpretation. Medieval scholars often used allegory to extract multiple layers of meaning from a single text, often aligning these meanings with church doctrine. Luther, however, insisted that the Bible should be read in its plain, literal sense. For him, the text spoke for itself, and imposing external meanings was a form of manipulation. This stance was a reaction against the perceived abuses of the Church, where Scripture was often twisted to fit preconceived dogmas. Luther's literalism, however, was not as straightforward as it might seem. In many cases, his literal interpretations were heavily influenced by his own theological convictions. For instance, he rejected the traditional, spiritual interpretation of the Song of Songs, which saw the lovers as representing Christ and the Church. Instead, Luther proposed that the book was about good government, a reading that many modern scholars find equally metaphorical and far from the text's apparent meaning. Similarly, his interpretation of Psalm chapter 19, verses 4, where he saw the voice of the heavens as referring to the preaching ministry of the apostles, is a clear example of how his own beliefs shaped his understanding of the text. Luther's approach to prophecy is another area where his literalism is called into question. He saw many Old Testament prophecies as direct predictions of Jesus, rejecting alternative interpretations that saw them as referring to historical figures or events. This selective literalism, where certain passages are taken at face value while others are reinterpreted, highlights the complexity of Luther's hermeneutical method. His reading of prophecy was not a neutral, unbiased engagement with the text, but a theologically driven interpretation that aligned with his broader theological framework. The doctrine of justification by grace through faith, one of the central tenets of Luther's theology, is a prime example of how his ideas were both derived from and imposed upon the Bible. While this doctrine can be found in certain passages of the New Testament, particularly in the letters of Paul, Luther's universal application of it to the entire Bible is a significant departure from a strictly literal reading. The dialectic of law and gospel, another key concept in Luther's theology, further illustrates this point. Luther saw the law as a tool to bring people to a recognition of their sin, and the gospel as the means of salvation. This framework, while rooted in certain biblical texts, is a generalized hermeneutical scheme that Luther applied to the entire Bible. The theory of the uses of the law is another area where Luther's interpretation diverges from a straightforward reading of the text. For Luther, the law had three primary uses: to restrain sin in society, to bring people to a recognition of their sin and need for grace, and to provide guidance for the justified. While the first two uses can be found in the Bible, the third use is more contested. Some Lutherans have argued that there is no biblical basis for the third use of the law, while others see it as a logical extension of Luther's overall theology. This debate underscores the tension between Luther's claim to a clear and self-interpreting Bible and the reality of his own interpretive framework. Luther's attitude towards the Old Testament is also marked by ambivalence. While he maintained that the gospel was present in the Old Testament and that the law was not entirely abrogated in the New, his views on the Old Testament were often colored by his anti-Jewish sentiments. He saw the Jewish law as a temporary and limited revelation, and his treatment of the Ten Commandments reflects this view. For example, he regarded the prohibition of images as a specifically Jewish law, not binding on Christians, and he omitted it from his summary of the commandments in his catechisms. This selective reading of the Old Testament further highlights the ways in which Luther's theology influenced his biblical interpretation. The Reformed tradition, represented by figures like John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli, took a different approach to the Bible. While they shared Luther's dislike of allegorization and his emphasis on the authority of Scripture, they tended to treat the Old and New Testaments more equally as parts of a single, coherent revelation. Calvin, in particular, wrote extensive commentaries on the Old Testament, seeing it as a historical account of God's dealings with humanity that could still instruct Christians in righteous living. This more balanced approach to the Old Testament stands in contrast to Luther's sometimes dismissive attitude. Calvin's theology, while sharing many principles with Luther's, also diverged in significant ways. Calvin's doctrine of double predestination, the idea that God has predestined some to salvation and others to damnation, is a logical extension of the idea of justification by grace. This doctrine, while rooted in certain passages of the Bible, particularly in the book of Romans, is a stark and often controversial aspect of Reformed theology. Unlike Luther, who was more comfortable with paradox and mystery, Calvin sought to follow his theological insights to their logical conclusions. This led to a more rigid and deterministic view of salvation, which has had a lasting impact on Reformed Christianity. Despite the differences between Luther and Calvin, both figures were driven by a deep commitment to the Bible as the ultimate source of truth. Their approaches to biblical interpretation, while not always consistent or unbiased, reflect a shared desire to return to the original meaning of the text. However, their interpretations were inevitably shaped by their own theological frameworks and the historical contexts in which they lived. In conclusion, Martin Luther's legacy in biblical interpretation is a complex and often paradoxical one. While he championed the clarity and authority of the Bible, his readings were heavily influenced by his own beliefs and the challenges he faced. The Reformation, in many ways, was a product of this dynamic tension between a return to the biblical text and the imposition of new interpretive frameworks. The impact of Luther's ideas continues to be felt in Christian theology and practice, a testament to the enduring power of his vision and the ongoing debates it has sparked.